sustainable, and also maybe even more expansive. I'm going to try to focus on the topic that I was given, and that is the role of NGOs and activists around the world. And I think that we all noticed that this time round, there was something different in terms of how the world and public opinion handled the events in Palestine. From the events of Sheikh Jarrah, which moved then to Al-Aqsa, and then which moved on to Gaza, and contained or encapsulated all of Palestine. The global reaction is something that we need to take stock of and build upon. There is no doubt that there was a new tone in the way that the public media and public opinion analyzed and handled what was happening in Palestine. And I'm going to try to discuss those as to what were the new elements, what were the new indications, and then how we can utilize those, take advantage of those, and also build upon them for further gains in terms of public awareness and public opinion. There is no question that there are new dynamics within the handling of the case of Palestine. The very first, I wrote an article which was published in Al Jazeera in Arabic a couple of weeks ago that focused on the element of a new generation. We are in the midst of a massive youth movement around the world, those who are in Palestine and actually suffering the daily implications and effects of occupation and the Israeli barbaric attacks and the such, as well as a younger generation throughout the world that is receiving the news, the images in various ways, which we'll talk about, and analyzing them in ways that are free from the restrictions that were imposed in previous days. So this new generation, whether it be on the Palestinian side or whether it even be on the Israeli side, it's something that I think is one of the most interesting elements that need to be discussed and analyzed. The fact that the new generation of Palestinians, of Arabs, as well as of Muslims, and I'll come to the global population beyond the elements of Arabism or Islam or the such, but that's that generation, my generation, for instance, and maybe the younger generation, grew up being heavily burdened by decades of failure, decades of corruption, decades of oppression, decades of lies, of deceptions on every single level, and to an extent where there is a despondent mood, there is a kind of desperation, if you wish. And even when there are good news that emerge, there is the tendency to treat them with trepidation and hesitancy and reluctance to actually celebrate those and build upon them or see them as probably transformative moments. On the other side, we have a new generation, even of Israelis, and definitely of Jews around the world, who are now treating the phenomenon of Israel away from the shackles of the Holocaust. We all abhor the crimes that were committed in Central Europe 60, 70 years ago, but the new generation is sort of free to think objectively and to see that Israel needs to be treated in the very same way that other states are treated. They see no exceptionalism to the state of Israel, and any suggestion of exceptionalism to them, according to the new narrative that is dominant culturally, intellectually, if you wish, is abhorrent, and is, to an extent, it's even a little bit offensive. So they treat matters as they see them, and the elements and the benchmarks upon which they treat the case of Israel and Palestine is totally different, I believe, from the way in which the older generations of Jews around the world treated the case of Israel. There's also obviously this new generation is far more capable and far more competent in using the new tools of communication and social media in ways that I wouldn't even know how to fathom, how to unlock. And this in itself, it's opening up new means of communication between generations across the world. For instance, when I find that youngsters whom I'm mentoring, for instance, they're communicating with people in Mexico, in Venezuela, in Togo, in Africa, in Australia, and Malaysia, around the world. People are now communicating in ways, in methods that weren't available, or I wasn't, or our generation didn't have the access or the know-how how to do so. And this is creating a parity in terms of understanding and awareness. So the news and the information that is available to a Palestinian inside Ramallah, inside Gaza, inside Jerusalem, inside Sheikh Jarrah, is readily available to any of their compatriots or their peers, regardless of where they may be. This is a new dynamic. This is an actual revolution in communication. Not only the revolution that I witnessed was, I wonder if Sister Bushra can switch off her mic. That would be lovely. So in my generation, the revolution was seeing the news, actually seeing the news the moment it was happening. But that's no longer a revolution. That's no longer something that is innovative. What's innovative is now that the emotions that accompany every single event that's taking place is being transferred, and it's being transformed, and it's being converted and conveyed in real time. That is absolutely new. So people are engaged not only from the news level, knowing what's happening, but they can see the impact, they can see the emotions. And this is something which is I think, something of a revolution in itself. Also, the emerging Palestinian voices, and particularly the young Palestinian voices. I recall back in 2008 and 2012, when the attacks against Gaza happened, the first and the second. One of our quarrels with mainstream media in the UK, for instance, with the BBC and others, was why don't you have Palestinian voices? I recall on one single day, there were something like 7 or 8 lengthy discussions with pro-Israeli voices, from the Israeli ambassador to Zionist organizations and the such, with not a single Palestinian voice. There was 1 or 2 British supporters of Palestine that weren't really given equity in terms of time. So when I would discuss with the editors or the producers in the BBC, their argument would be, well, there aren't really any Palestinian voices who can speak in English, who can convey the message well and the such. And to an extent, I mean, that was extremely offensive and unfair, but it was an issue that we had to deal with. Now we have a totally different scenario. Now we have young Palestinians. In fact, we have Palestinian children who can express their views, who can talk about their suffering in perfect English. In fact, it's quite fantastic how some of them speak with an American accent, using American euphemisms, and speaking to an audience in a way that is captivating. That is something new. There was always this disparity, this cultural gap. Even those who spoke English, there would be this cultural gap that would alienate them from the audiences. That's no longer there. We now have dozens of Palestinian youngsters mainly, and we only have, the likes of Mohammad al-Kurd and his family, for instance, who have now become stars, who are now being invited on mega shows in America and throughout Europe and the such, in order to speak about their cases. And that's something which I think is a new dynamic. Obviously, we have the Jewish voices, something that we saw clearly in the demonstrations that were attended by 150,000, by 200,000. Yesterday, for instance, in London, or on Saturday in London, there were 3,000 people in front of Downing Street. Now, those who know London and know Downing Street, it's a very, very limited and confined area. So to have 3,000 people, you've basically locked the entire district of Whitehall and Westminster. And a huge attendance of Jewish organizations, Jewish voices, Jewish speakers was there. And that is something that we're seeing more and more every single time Israel commits a crime against either Gaza or Al-Aqsa or the such. We find that there are more and more Jewish voices, standing tall and standing loud and clear in order to express their opposition to this. New terminology. Now, when we talk about, regarding the discourse or the narrative, if you wish, we're talking about terms, we're talking about statements, phrases, we're talking about imagery, we're talking about voices. And all of this is now developing for the very first time, and I believe Professor Sami Al-Arian will speak about this, the phenomenon that mainstream big American media actually come out with headlines labeling Israel with Zionism, with racism, with apartheid. Is something, talking about Israel as an occupation. This is something that is new. And it's happened in virtually every single mainstream American media, probably bar Fox News, although there were also some statements held there. That's something which is new. Talking about war crimes committed by Israel, talking about the suffering of Palestinians, showing the images of the children that were killed by the Israeli attacks on Gaza. That is new. Now, in the final couple of minutes that I have, what can we do on the level of NGOs and on a level of activists in order to build upon this? All this is a reality, and we're seeing this. Every single time there is a call for a protest or a vigil or a statement or a petition on Palestine, we are finding increasing numbers, and not increasing by 2%, 5%. We're seeing exponential expansions and increases in the numbers that are willing to put their names and put their time and effort in terms of showing their support for Palestine. One of the most important movements around the world today, and one of the most impactful and effective, is the BDS, is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And had it not been, and this is an argument that I often have with even some of my own colleagues about, well, how effective is this? Had it not been impactful and effective, the world would not have fought it in the way that it has. The American government, the British government, several European governments have tried their level best to criminalize BDS and to criminalize those who support BDS or uphold BDS or take part in BDS. And that, to me, is sufficient claim. And, we have, for instance, one of my colleagues here in London, one of the accusations leveled against him by the Israeli state is that he supports BDS. That's one of the accusations against him. So had it not been for the impactfulness and effectiveness and the hurt that BDS causes the occupation and the Zionist state, I don't think that we would have seen this kind of resistance to it. The protests, the vigils, the marches, and all these are, while some may think that they change little in the dynamics, but what they do is that they actually show to people the level of support and antagonism, support for Palestine and antagonism towards Israel that there is around the world. And this also sends a very clear message to our brothers and sisters in Palestine itself, living under the conditions of oppression, as to what the world is saying and how it's standing in the such. We need to engage the academic fields and the intellectual fields. Now, these fields, as important as they are, but their voices aren't being heard as they should be. And the vast majority, the greatest volume of the academic spheres and the intellectual spheres are actually in support of Palestine and the Palestinians. The books that are written, the essays that are written, the comments that are being made, the statements that are being issued, they all show something which we can actually use, utilize, and build upon, especially that people are less trusting of politicians and media personnel than they are of people of sound academic background. And that is why it's so important, where we get so totally upset regarding a pro-Israel or pro-Zionist article in the Times, but we pay little attention to how many voices there are from the academic sphere in support of the Palestinian rights and critical of Israel. So I'll stop here. I look forward to hearing from each of the guests and hopefully then taking part in the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Anas. It was a very lovely speech. Thank you very much. I think the major players are the Palestinian youth and also Jewish voices. We have also the intellectuals and the academics. They're very important in developing this narrative. I would like to welcome Dr. Basem Naim. He is the former Minister of Health in Palestine. Seems that your mic is off, Dr. Basem.
Shukran, Doctor. Shukran.
Thank you very much. So, okay.
Honored to be with you.
Thank you very much. Then we were supposed to start with Dr. Basem. So now, inshallah, we'll give him the mic to speak about how Palestinians presented their narrative during the 2021 war. And I think Dr. Basem was one of the most active people in this regard. He appeared almost all over the world in different media outlets, also participated in lectures, maybe seminars, etc. So it would be lovely if he just give us that view from inside. Thank you very much. Dr. Basem, you may begin. You have 15 minutes.
شكرا جزيلا. السلام عليكم جميعا and good evening everyone from Gaza here. To be honest, I was intending to hear more than to speak because I want to hear from our brothers and sisters, our supporters, friends from outside, how do they see? And I was appreciating what I heard from Dr. Anas a few minutes ago. But to say a few words about how Palestinians presented their narrative during the last aggression or escalation against Palestine in general and Gaza in particular, I have to say the following. First of all, maybe for the first time, we have witnessed a significant change when it comes to the Palestinian narrative all over the world, not only through in social media, but also partially in mainstream media. Maybe because of the pressure of social media, which has flooded the whole world with real-time stories. Therefore, the mainstream media, they have no excuse to deny these facts here on the ground. But I have to say that these changes are, the most important question is now, are these changes, which is for me were significant, are they continuous, sustainable at the level of time and their quality? This is what we have to talk about more. How can we continue, how we achieve such significant changes for longer times and in more depth? We have here faced during presenting our narrative in the Palestinian narrative in the media and the international media, we have faced a lot of challenges, to be honest. One of these challenges is the tools. We were, you can say we were nearly blocked to talk to any of the big mainstream media, especially in the West, when it comes to Europe and the United States. And it was nearly impossible even to reply to an article wrote about Gaza or about Palestine or about resistance or about Hamas. Even we have asked a lot of mainstream media outlets to reply to these articles, and they have refused to give us a chance to respond. This time we have seen that they have asked us to participate in interviews, in webinars, and I'm talking about also big mainstream medias like ABC News or Sky News, BBC, PNR, and maybe this is for the first time. And here I have to say I was talking to such big media outlets with my position representing the movement here. And this is, I think this is a very significant and important breakthrough. But what was more was clearer when it comes to the social media. I am sure all the participants here can agree with me that for the first time that the social media, despite of all attempts of the Facebook administration or Twitter or Instagram to silence the Palestinian narrative or to limit the Palestinian narrative from reaching the people outside, ordinary people everywhere, they have failed because, again, it was like a gush of information at real time coming from Palestine, Sheikh Jarrah, Gaza, Al-Aqsa compound. And therefore, I think social media played a very important role in helping us conveying this message in different languages, 24 hours, 7 days a week. Despite, I hear that that Facebook, in addition to the regular censoring tools he put when it comes to the Palestinian narrative, they have launched an extra operational room for Gaza during the escalation to limit as much as they can the information coming out from Gaza about the events here. Despite of this, they have failed to block or to limit or to silence the Palestinian narrative. And I have always mentioned the statement of TikTok that half of the humanity, half of the people around the world have seen Palestine during these 11 days. Again, we have observed significant change, but we have at the same time faced a lot of challenges, to be honest. The first one is the language. I was asked from different media outlets in Brazil, in Argentina, and in other countries, in Russia, to talk to the media in their original languages. And we haven't found anyone who can speak on behalf of the people here in Gaza, in particular on behalf of the movement or resistance, to talk to the media in their original languages. I have talked, for example, to a big media outlet in Brazil, but it was in English and then translated in Portuguese. Then it took a lot of time, and I'm sure we are losing a lot of the depth and of the messages sent to the people there. The language was one of the biggest challenges we have faced. Maybe English was, we can say it was acceptable. We have a lot of people here who can communicate in English in a good language, in good accent. But when it comes to other French, German, Russian, Portuguese, or Spanish, it was a big problem. The second challenge was the terminology. The terminology and the context. You know that for decades, the Zionist lobby has succeeded to create terminology which is adopted from nearly all big media outlets, and partially also by of the social media. Even sometimes some of our supporters and some of our friends, they are adopting the same terminology, which is against international law, against the Palestinian cause. It was like mixing between terrorism and resistance, or talking about political solution within a context. Therefore, I have been always facing the problem that the first question I have received from nearly all journalists who have contacted me, why you are launching rockets against civilians in Israel? This is the first question. Again, this is because there is a terminology, there is a context have been created for decades, and you have to defend always. And I have always refused to start from this point. And I have always indicated that we have to go back some steps to understand the context of this conflict, that the story didn't start by launching rockets from Gaza or the resistance of Hamas. It has started years and years before by occupying Palestine, 48, 67, and so on and so on. And even in the last escalation, the story didn't start in Gaza. It started in Sheikh Jarrah, and by forceful expelling of the people from their houses, and in Al-Aqsa compound by trying to change or attempts to change the status quo. Therefore, the terminology is one of the biggest challenges. Within this context, I have to say that also the Palestinian narrative was divided. You receive a Palestinian narrative coming out from Gaza and some areas here or there, and another one coming from Ramallah. This divided narrative about the relationship to the occupation, about the right of resistance, about the kind of resistance we can use, about Sheikh Jarrah, Al-Aqsa, Gaza, the siege, international law. This was also one of the biggest challenges we are facing, our divided terminology and the divided Palestinian narrative. One of the biggest challenges we have faced is the culture. Some people who are talking from Gaza or from Jerusalem or from Nablus, or sometimes even from outside, when they talk to the Americans or to the Europeans, or they don't make any change between the people in Brazil and the people in the United States and the people in the UK, or between UK and Germany, with its very long, very sensitive history when it comes to Jews, for example. This lack of knowledge about the culture of people we are talking to, this was also one of the challenges we have faced. Look, I know that the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Israel is issuing its statements usually in 10 languages at the same time, and most of the people who are talking on behalf of the state are usually indigenous people from these states. And you can call back the interview with the the Palestinian ambassador in Spain, and the spokesman of the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spanish. And it was impressive how he is talking, how he's defending his narrative when it compared to the other one. Therefore, the culture was one of the biggest challenges we have faced here. One of the challenges we are facing, our tools. We don't have here any serious tools to talk to the people outside. Yani, if you exclude people who are talking through social media, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, you have nearly zero media outlets talking to the people in their languages. And this is one of the biggest problems we are facing. When we add to this that our diplomatic tools in UK, in the United States, in Brazil, in South Africa, everywhere, they are not doing their job. to help the people there to understand the Palestinian narrative within the context of that country. This was also one of the biggest challenges, that we don't have the tools, we don't have the resources, the cadres. Again, I think we have witnessed a big or significant change in favor of the Palestinian narrative, because otherwise we were not able to see these hundreds of thousands of people, normally ordinary people, ordinary citizens, mobilized in a lot of cities in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, everywhere, to support the Palestinian just cause without these informations. But how to keep the momentum and how to push forward this progress and to solidify these changes in favor of the Palestinian cause, if we don't tackle or fix these problems, these very important problems or challenges, I think we will go back soon to the previous situation of, again, portraying the situation as if it is a conflict between Hamas and Israel, or it is a conflict between some group of terrorists and a very civilized country. I hope we can, again, I want to hear more, that we can hear from our honored guests today, how can we develop our facilities, our capabilities, our resources to support these or to amplify these significant changes in favor of the Palestinian cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Basem. I guess we have a lot to work on, especially on speakers in foreign languages, because as Dr. Anas said earlier, that when we had speakers, fluent speakers in English language, we were able to convey the Palestinian message in a very effective way. Yet, alhamdulillah, nowadays we have a lot of youth who are able to speak in different foreign languages, especially from Gaza, although they are limited in numbers, but I think, inshallah, that is a very promising thing. I would like to move to Dr. Sami Al-Arian. Dr. Sami Al-Arian, as I mentioned earlier, the director of Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, and a very well-known Palestinian thinker and academic. He will be talking today about the impact of the Palestinian narrative on Western societies and decision makers. Please go ahead, Dr. Sami.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for the Asia Middle East Forum and the other organizers of this important event. I would like to confine my remarks regarding Western society, certainly as Dr. Basem said, that culture makes a difference, and it also has to be taken within that context. When we talk about the Palestinian narrative, this is a phenomenon that is fairly new. The Zionist narrative had dominated, has dominated Western societies for over a century. In fact, it had the field to itself for a long time. So when we talk about Palestinian narrative, it hasn't really been developed to the point where we say that it made inroads. But when we take back what do we mean by the Zionist narrative, we have to stop a bit and try to analyze it, because the Zionist movement is part and parcel of Western society. While relatively speaking, when we talk about the Palestinian narrative, it's not looked at as part of the historical experience or development in the West, while the Zionist movement is in fact a Western phenomenon on its own. The nature of the Zionist movement, which was established towards the end of the 19th century, it was established in Europe. And as a consequence, as a result of how the Jewish communities felt that they have been discriminated against, and how the Western societies, particularly again in Europe, had treated its own Jewish communities. So it started in this nation-state discourse that was taking place in Europe and then throughout the world after that, as basically a settler colonialist movement in the same way that other colonialist movements started in Europe. Because of, again, in this particular case, because of anti-Semitism that the Jewish communities thought that they were subjected to, but also it came in the spirit of a colonialist, imperialist project as part of Western imperialism. So it's very important that we understand this, because that phenomena, that understanding also tells us a lot about why such a phenomena, such a project was part of Western society and how it understands its history and its development. In the nation-state paradigm, the establishment of a Jewish state, the establishment of a Zionist state in the heart of the Muslim world also played as a strategic objective, because during that time there was this transition in world affairs where the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating, that the Ottoman Empire was being pulled apart, fragmented, and the establishment of a foreign body in the midst, in the heart of the Muslim world, would play in the minds of strategic thinkers of imperialist powers as a very important phenomena by which it can keep this area, this region, as also fragmented, polarized, disintegrating, as well as permanently unable to meet a challenges such as the Zionist challenge. So it did play a strategic part that it's very important to take note of. And that's also part of the Zionist narrative, that the Jewish state, the Zionist entity, will always be tied to one of the great powers by which it can serve, functionally speaking, it can serve its interests. In fact, if we go and look at many of the sayings, many of the discourses of Zionist leaders, they always championed themselves. They always told their audiences how important that is to the advancement of interest, whether it was in Britain at one point or now the US. The other point that needs to be also mentioned is the impact of religion and culture. Many people discount this. Yes, the Zionist movement is in fact a secular movement at its heart. It has very little to do with Judaism except to exploit the ties, the spiritual ties, as they perceive Jews have to the land of Palestine. Of course, in terms of many of the findings, particularly archaeological findings, there is very little relationship there. But putting that aside, we find that the rise of Messianic Christianity, as the evangelical movements, as well as the idea of the return of Jews to the Holy Land, or the return of Jesus at the end of times, where they love Israel but hate the Jews. This particular one also has an impact, culturally speaking, as well as at the societal level, where there is an advantage to the Zionist narrative, where the other, which in this case the Palestinians or the Arabs or the Muslims or the Eastern Christians, are dismissed, where they no longer are looked at in the same level as this biased nature of how God has favored some group over others, of how the establishment of Israel is going to be the stepping stone towards the return of Jesus or to the return of end of time. So this also played for a long time as part of the evangelical, Messianic, or Zionist narrative. So when you tie the historical nature and how this movement is pretty much tied to the Western experience, and it is a purely, by the way, Jewish, Western Jewish experiences, because the Jews of the East did not go through the same experience. In fact, they were deceived by Zionists, and the majority of the Sephardic, so-called or Eastern Jews, they didn't go through the same experience, historical experience. In fact, someone like Bernard Lewis would call the experience of the Jews of Islam, as he called them, and the same, of course, was termed by Ismail Farouqi, is that this was the golden age of Judaism in the past 2,000 years when they lived actually under Islamic societies. Again, putting that aside, we have to look at that narrative as the experience of Western Jews, as the experience of European, the product of the European experience. Yes, they were anti-Semitic. Yes, they went through persecution, but also they exploited that fact in order to gain the sympathy of the West, first to atone to their crimes against Jews, but more importantly, also to serve the interest of neo-colonialist powers, whether it was Britain or now the United States. And that's how they built a settler colonialist movement in the midst of the Muslim world. And of course, they had to use terms by which they can be looked at positively, being the only democracy of the Middle East, being, the state of law, where it is tied to Western civilization and modernity, where they are fighting basically barbaric people, and so on and so forth. And for a long time, this kind of discourse gained ground. When you add to that the state institutions, those, whether it was a state controlled by the state or whether it was in a capitalist system where capitalist institutions basically rule the contours of the state, whether it was in the media, in the business world, in politicians, and of course, financing these politicians, and so on and so forth, you can see the insurmountable challenges that any kind of a different discourse or a narrative could gain ground. Now, what we have seen recently, but we can also date it back at least to 10 years ago, that there is a new narrative that is being formed. We could see it, for example, when former President Carter wrote Peace or Apartheid, when he was talking about in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which he was talking about how Israel, this darling of the West, is turning into an apartheid. Of course, it's not something that he's discovered. It's just something that has been going on for a long time. We can talk about that, but we don't have the time to go over the details. But this kind of language was being formed to the horror of Zionist forces. And of course, they couldn't stop it because as a former president, somebody who's been on the ground, who's seen it, it was very difficult, but they tried to contain it. And then we saw different books and different narratives, somebody like Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer. These are very prominent strategic and international relations experts in the United States, one at Harvard, the other at the University of Chicago, talking about the Jewish lobby and its impact on policymaking and how that is detrimental to the interests of the United States. Putting aside that the US actually is a neo-imperial power and it is advancing basically an empire, objectives for an empire, putting that aside, to raise such a question and question the institutions that are trying to push the Zionist narrative in society and make it equivalent to American interest, that by itself also has gained impact. Add to that also that the whole idea of Zionism, particularly when we talk about the liberal trend of Zionism, was to establish Israel, but at the same time to make sure it is sustained, it stays, it's permanent. It doesn't get to the point where it can implode. That is in contrast to the Messianic Zionism, where they think that this is something ordained by God and that somehow we are going to take the whole land, the project, Greater Israel. Of course, this contention has always been there within labor Zionism and revisionist Zionism, but it turned out that at least since 1977, but certainly for the past 15 years, this notion of the extreme right of Greater Israel, of pushing the Palestinians to the brink of even forgetting or imploding this notion of a two-state solution, many of these labor Zionists or liberal Zionists are saying that this could be the seed of destruction for the whole Zionist project. It's enough that the Palestinians, at least from the PLO side, from these Palestinian factions, they have already recognized Israel on 78% of Palestine. I think that's more enough. We can probably get another 5 or 6%, but that should satisfy us. That means Zionism has triumphed. But the other side of Zionism, the revisionist ones, the extreme rights, the messianic ones, they are not content with that. They think Palestinians should get nothing. Because if you say that I am going to recognize in their mind the West Bank as Palestinian, why not Jaffa? Why not Haifa? Why not Al-Lid? Why not Al-Ramle? Why not Nazareth? Why not the rest of Palestine? Because they are well the same. So we are not going to give them an inch, and we're going to take it over, and we have a plan to do that. That by itself, of course, that will bring you back to the notion that what about Western values, even if they are masked under certain concepts, now you have to face what are you going to do about Palestinians? The whole notion of Zionism was to take the land and kick out, expel the people. Now, if the people, some of the people are there, and now even when you look at historical Palestine, the number of Palestinians in historical Palestine today exceeds the Jews. So on two levels, Zionism has failed. It failed to attract most of the Jews into Palestine because we have about perhaps 6.5 out of 15 or 16 million people. That means they couldn't even attract half. And we also have half of the Palestinian people inside Palestine that they couldn't expel. So on these two levels, Zionism or the Zionist project has failed. So what is the future of that? The future of that would be, according to the Messianic Jews, is that the Palestinians will either have to be put down as second-class citizen, meaning an apartheid in action, or they have to be expelled. And both of these options are not accepted by the liberal notion of the West. And now they have to face the music. They have to face these facts. You know, Kerry, the former Secretary of State of the United States, on his way out when Trump was elected, alluded to this fact, as same as Obama, that we are faced with either a two-state solution in which we can preserve the Zionist notion, the Zionist project of having an Israeli Jewish state, or we are faced with an apartheid. Now, this is almost 10 years ago. This was 5 years ago when they mentioned that. Now we come to the point where everybody agrees after the disastrous presidency of Trump trying to impose a greater Israel concept and expand the Zionist ideas not only to Christians and Jews, but also to other Muslim states, to bless this project and to try to do away with any Palestinian right. This had backfired, and we've seen that. But I want to caution that this has not yet at the point of decision makers. We are still dealing with two types of narratives. You still have the Zionist narrative dominating the business community, the politicians, the mainstream media, the part of institutions within the society, particularly in the United States, where it's very difficult to penetrate. But what we've seen as something that is new and novel is that there are voices now that are within these communities who have spoken up, whether it is celebrities, politicians, whether it is some sorts of a media after the expansion of the media now and the break of the monopoly of certain institutions. We see now different voices which compelled mainstream media, such as the New York Times, such as the Washington Post, and other mainstream outlets, to at least allow the Palestinian narrative, so to speak, even some space in order to be heard. And of course, that didn't come out of their own volition, but it came because of the change of the dynamics within society. Because in the past 5 years, we saw the rise of the Black Power movement, or the Black Lives movement. We saw that we have a new discourse on multinational corporations, on unrestrained capitalism, on how society is being ruled, as the inequality in both income as well as education, and so on and so forth. All these movements come together and they put a lot of pressure on society to re-examine itself, particularly with the rise of Trumpism, because the election of Trump put this society at test. They are seeing now that we are facing the extremists in our society, this white supremacy. It is no different from what Zionism is trying to do with Jewish supremacy in the Holy Land or in Palestine. So you cannot disassociate these two things from each other. the rise of white supremacy is very simple, similar to the rise of Jewish supremacy. And if you're going to reject white supremacy in the United States or in Europe or in other places, how can you accept Jewish supremacy in Palestine? So what they're trying to do now is to square a circle that cannot be squared. How are we going to accept Zionism with its central theme being that Jewish people are above everyone else, because that's the whole essence of Zionism. You know, the chosen people, that there must be a Jewish state, that we have two systems, one for Jews and one for non-Jews. And that's not just in rhetoric. This is an actual policy, a policy that has been adopted, that has been implemented on the ground. When you go to the Sheikh Jarrah and say that these houses belong to Jews, to settlers who've never set foot there, and we have to kick out for Palestinians, and you do this over and over and over again, then you cannot just, you know, play dumb and say, we don't know. You know, as Finkelstein says, we know too much now. You know, in the past, you could probably say that I didn't know much. Now, you know a lot. And that knowledge, you cannot put it aside. So the only choices really you have is to save Zionism from itself by imposing a two-state solution. But it seems like that train has left the station. You can't really do this anymore. That leaves you with only one option, which is either you accept apartheid or fight apartheid. And I think within Western societies today, this debate is at its highest. You have the old school in which it's very difficult for them to oppose Zionist narratives and to oppose Zionist doctrine and to go against, you know, those who have been sustaining them, whether politically or in business or in media or in other places. And you have the new generation who don't accept apartheid and don't accept unrestrained capitalism and don't accept putting Jews and putting blacks and Arabs and Latins and Latinos and so on and so forth down. They want there's a new generation that calls for social justice, that calls for that question racial inequality, that talks about these in excesses and so on and so forth. And the Palestinian cause has become the basically a rallying point. It has replaced, you know, in the past where you have certain causes that were rallying point around the world. Today, Palestine is such a word. So you have the activists, the peace activists, the social justice activists coming together and presenting in a very powerful way by electing their own people, not just trying to make deals. You know, when you have the Ilhan Omar of the world and the Rashida Tlaib of the world and Jamal Brown of the world and all and the Alexandra and so on and so, all these people come together and but they are not there yet. I mean, this is going to be let me conclude by this, since I don't know if I'm out of time or not. So what we see today is that this experience has given us a glimpse into the future, by which we can say that building a worldwide movement towards a free Palestine is possible. And when I say worldwide movement, I'm talking about across the world, by which we can look back what happened in the 80s during the South African apartheid experience, where for decades, people were not hearing about what's happening in South Africa, but suddenly it burst into the world conscience, where we saw how within a few years, the whole notion of apartheid South Africa collapsed on its own. And this is very, 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 very important to note, that our goal should no longer be about a state. See, the Palestinian Authority is living in the past. They have gambled, they lost. All what they want to do was to establish a state. Our struggle is not about the state. Our struggle is about justice. Our struggle is about the people. And when we talk about this, we talk about all the people, including obviously even Jewish people. I think what we need to talk about here is the Palestine that is free of the Zionist menace, that our goal should be to dismantle Zionist structures and institutions, regardless of what political system emerges after that. That is a fight for another day. So there should be no more illusion about coexistence between Zionism in its Jewish supremacy, in its notion of having a hierarchy within society of preferring or denying Palestinians' rights, including those who are outside. I'll conclude in 1 minute.
Almost took double time, so we have to conclude there.
All right, I conclude by saying that this should be our goal. And to do that, we need to build this worldwide movement, and that narrative should be addressed to the people in this context, the context of free Palestine from all kinds of Zionist entities. That includes its structures and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, it is a very rich discussion, and we have to think maybe in other ways, maybe lectures, not really some kind of webinar, but maybe lectures, a series of lectures to try to explain, understand this phenomenon. Thank you very much, Dr. Sami. Let's move to Dr. Daoud Abdullah, Director of Middle East Monitor, MEMO, and a well-known Muslim leader in the United Kingdom. He will be talking about the image of Palestinian resistance in Western media and public opinion. By the way, Dr. Daoud Abdullah recently wrote a book on Hamas. So it would be very useful if he could enlighten us on this very important issue. Thank you very much. You may start, Dr. Daoud.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammad, and my colleagues who have spoken before. You have no doubt given me a very formidable task to speak after such learned and distinguished speakers, but I'll try to add to what was said before. And I'll begin by pointing out one of the most notable episodes that occurred during the last encounter between the resistance in Palestine and the Zionist entity, as it played out in the Western media. And here I'm referring to a question posed by Said Erakat on the 10th of May to the State Department spokesman, Ned Price. A simple question: do Palestinians have a right to self-defense? And the American State Department official, he said, well, you see, Said, we believe in the principle that every state has a right to self-defense. So that threw up another question. The Palestinians don't have a state. So as a people, do they have a right to self-defense? You see? And this is something that has been ongoing for years, you know, and it reached its climax during the Trump administration with the whole notion of the deal of the century and a grab for everything. The PA in Ramallah actually made several appeals to the international community. Please send us international protectors, you know, save us from these marauding settlers, you know, who burn houses, who burn children and babies in their homes, let alone destroy olive trees, you see. But no one responded to these calls for decades. No one responded. And that is the context. We heard about context early on. This is the context of what happened, you know, last month. That a resistance movement took it upon itself to respond to the cries of its compatriots in another part of the occupied homeland. See? So that brought out the fact that the discourse, the narrative on Palestine today is gradually changing. No more is the issue seen as something as, you know, a war on terror, you know, and self-defense only. It's a question of settler colonialism also. And freedom and independence and dignity, you know, for a people. And by the way, it was not until 1969 that the UN actually adopted a resolution recognizing the Palestinians as a people. For the first 2 decades after the Nakba, they were simply referred to as refugees. You see, and this terminology, this label, as it were, enables governments to evade their responsibility towards the Palestinian people and their national rights. So what came after 1969 was a recognition of the Palestinian resistance, you see, alongside those resistance movements in Southern Africa, in Mozambique, in Angola, you know, and South Africa itself. All the resolutions that came after 1969 about the right to self-defense and the right to self-determination and the right to freedom and independence, by all means, including armed struggle, those resolutions named Palestine, you know, specifically. But as I said, it took 2 decades before we got to this point. Now, where are we today? My previous speakers, you know, pointed to the fact that there is a change, and you, Mr. Chair, Dr. Mohammad also mentioned that there is some change in the media discourse. Admittedly so, but there is resistance still, you know, in some of the corporate media, in some of the official media circles. There is pushback. There is a pushback, you know, and this is why, you know, the BBC, for example, it starts with the rockets from Gaza. It does not start with, you know, the attacks on Sheikh Jarrah. It does not start with the assault on Masjid al-Aqsa. It starts with Gaza. So this is an element, you see, of the media contest that has to be challenged. And the notable thing about the BBC in particular is that it is funded by the taxpayers. Every citizen, every homeowner, every television owner must pay a tax to the BBC to keep the BBC running. So we have to think, we have to devise, we have to create some form of mechanism to ensure that the BBC serves our interest, and it does not continue this, you know, blind, slavish repetition and representation of one narrative. So that is a challenge, I think, for all our thinkers, activists, decision makers. We have to collaborate and to find ways to address this issue. But there are, and one has to acknowledge the positives, you know, that has come out of the recent encounter. And, you know, for example, The Guardian, you know, as another British newspaper, although it was traditionally seen as leftist, you know, or liberal in its content, The Guardian, its editor in 1917, C.P. Scott, actually lobbied with Wiseman for the Balfour Declaration. You see, and with all the efforts of the editor of the Guardian in 1917, perhaps the declaration would not have been given at that time. For he was very influential, the C.P. Scott, and the newspaper at the time, it was called the Manchester Guardian. Now after this recent encounter, you know, with the resistance in Palestine, the Guardian admitted openly, in a most unprecedented manner, that it had one of the worst decisions it had made throughout its history, its publishing history, was to support the Balfour Declaration and to support the Zionist project in Palestine. This is The Guardian, which over 100 years ago, it did what? It supported the project to colonize Palestine. Today, it wants to wash its hands and say, well, you know, we did wrong. We did wrong to the Palestinian people. We did wrong to humanity, you know, by supporting this colonial enterprise. No, we have to build on this. We have to engage with writers in The Guardian. In the previous military confrontations in 2012 and so on, they published articles by Brother Khalid Mishal or Ismail Hani and so on, occasionally. How can this be sustained? How can the narrative of the resistance and the Palestinians generally be given more coverage, a fairer space, amount of space, you know, as is afforded to the other side on its pages? You see, Dr. Anna spoke about limited time given to Palestinians on the airwaves. And this is true. You know, we've seen an opening here. There's a crack in the wall here in The Guardian. How can we build on it? The New York Times, during the encounter, also published an article by Peter Beinart, you know, talking about the right of return and as an inalienable right, you know, for the Palestinian people. This is a change. This represents something is happening. You know, before 10, 15 years ago, no one wanted to entertain talk about the right of return. Oh, you want to destroy the state of Israel. You're fighting a demographic war against us. What would happen to Israel's Jewish identity if the Palestinians return? Now you have Jewish voices advocating for it. Will we build on this? Will we find, you know, think carefully, you know, constructively how to ensure that this narrative remains, you know, in the public mind, in the public consciousness, you know, and that takes me forward to the whole issue, because we spoke about continuity, you know, in the narrative and what has been happening. Well, yes, the BDS started in 2005, you know. It didn't start yesterday. And it started through the efforts of 170 Palestinian trade unions, national organizations, civil society institutions. 170 started in Palestine in 2000. Today it is a global movement. Today it is a global movement, and it represents, it has grown, it has evolved, it has continued. It has sustained itself over that period, you see, and that should be acknowledged and built upon. And we are seeing the fruits. We are seeing the fruits. Last week in Scotland, the Lothian Pension Fund voted to divest from Israel. This is a fund, a pension fund with over 84 billion pounds. In its assets, 84 billion, you know, and similar pension funds across Europe have preceded it in this action, but this is the second largest in Scotland, and that is important, you see. So we have, you know, the Irish foreign minister and the government in Ireland giving such unreserved support, you know, for Palestinian rights. You know, something very few governments across Europe have dared to do. You know, so again, I think we have to look at Scotland carefully, look at Ireland, develop relationships with political parties there, with the sources, you know, the bodies that have a political clout and acceptability in these societies. Now, the pushback, no doubt, has been coming from the government. And across Europe, in Britain, in Germany, and in France, these are the most avowed and committed, you know, governments to the Zionist project. In Britain, in particular, I mean, the Queen's speech of 2 or 3 weeks ago actually, you know, made a statement about. A statement to the effect that there must be a unified foreign policy, a unified approach to foreign policy, and that no institution in Britain must go off and support sanctions or boycott or divestment. And this is particularly geared towards the local municipalities. Local municipalities in various parts of the United Kingdom, whether we speak of Leicester, whether we speak of Falkirk, whether we speak of Glasgow or Aberdeen or Dundee, we're speaking about local municipalities that have endorsed the boycott of Israel and its goods. You see, so the government, you know, they actually tried to pass a law and to deny local governments funding if they supported the BDS movement. You see, to deny them funding, and the matter went to the High Court. And the bodies, including the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, which took the matter to the High, they won. They won in the High Court that what the government was trying to do was illegal. See, so the right to boycott, the right to divest your funds from an entity that is patently racist is a right, you know, that is natural, it's normal, it should be acceptable in a civilized society. And by the way, Israel, he was trying to, it sold itself for many years. The narrative in the media was, well, you see, this is a civilizational project. You know, they came to the region, to this part of the world, telling their sponsors, their patrons in the West, that we're going to civilize this part of the world, which is barbaric, which is dark, which is savage.
Dr. Daoud?
Oh, okay. Okay.
One more minute, please.
Okay, so that is the nature of the changes taking place. That this entity, you know, has no longer has the unreserved and blind support that it once had in the media and in public opinion. You see, I must point out that I heard Dr. Basem mention it about the Facebook. It's not just institutions in Palestine that are being blocked, that are being targeted. Institutions in the West, you know, that champion the Palestinian cause, they are also being targeted. And again, we have to find a way to ensure that our narrative gets out to the people who support, who want to listen. All the young people the 200,000 who marched in London last month, they didn't read the mainstream corporate media. They didn't listen to the BBC. They got it through Facebook and social media. We have to ensure, you know, that their civil rights, the right to information, you know, is guaranteed and is continued, you know, through whatever means, so that their interest, their commitment remains steadfast and loyal and enduring to the Palestinian cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the things that caught my attention that many of the supporters of the Zionist project actually are on the other side now. They're opposed to Israel, and there is a saying that the more you know Israel, the more you hate it, as if ignorance helps Israel. So as if the Zionist narrative main aim to cover the eyes of people and divert them from reality to some kind of virtual reality or virtual world, which is of course not real. So I think along with the internal dynamics, especially in the States, helped the Palestinian voice or pro-Palestinian voice to be heard more in mainstream media. But I agree with all speakers who said that the social media, which actually made the difference, because freedom to knowledge, freedom to information, freedom to express your views, even to share videos, video clips, and people reporting from the ground in Facebook Live, etc., made a hell of a difference in this respect. I would like also to hear some comments from brothers from India. Maybe Dr. Malik would like to speak. Let's hear from Dr. Malik for a few minutes.
Yes. Malik Motasim Khan from India. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. First, I would like to thank Asia Middle East Forum and India Palestine Friendship Forum for organizing this online webinar. Indian people are always with the cause of Palestine. And Indian Muslims always showing solidarity with the people of Palestine. Our countrymen also sharing their ideas with us, and they are very much with the cause of Palestine, because the most of our countrymen and Indian Muslims thinks that the issue of Palestine is the issue of justice. There is a fight between justice and a force which is occupying the land of Palestinians. This is the issue of justice. So we had to stand with the people of Palestine. This is the duty of human beings. As far as Muslims are concerned, we are having dual relationship. One is Masjid Aqsa, Baitul Muqaddas. So Indian Muslims are with the Palestine, issue of Palestine, as seeing this is the issue of justice, as well as this is the issue of Masjid Aqsa, Baitul Muqaddas. Now, with the help of this issue of Sheikh Jarrah, it has become now worldwide issue. Also, Palestine is a very old issue, but it generates worldwide sympathy and worldwide opinion, which helping the cause of Palestine. So now, as an Indian Muslims and an important member of Jamaat Islami Hind, I congratulate the people of Palestine and especially Hamas, as their efforts shows that now the Israel is not unbeatable. We know very, very much that Israel is a worldwide a military power. But the Gaza people, Hamas people had challenged them and showed Israel that the Israel is not unbeatable. I congratulate the leadership of Hamas and people of Palestine. But in last, I want to say that we should think on that. Many times we proceed by struggle and fighting on our with our cause, but we fail on the table, on the discussion, on the dialogue. So always we have to concentrate to improve our military power, improve our strength. This will decide, and our opponents will discuss with us. So we didn't compromise on the issue of strengthening the power strengthening the military power to fight with Zionists. Now, yes, I convey my salam and thanks for providing this opportunity. We Indian people and Indian Muslims are with you and expect and hope that inshallah very soon we will, Palestinian people will get the justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because we are talking about the narrative, and most probably all the participants are aware, at least partly, of the Western or the Palestinian narrative in Western media. Could you just comment on Palestinian narrative in Indian media?
Yes. In Indian media, now the sympathy and the view about Hamas has changed from this era. Now paradigm is shifted. Up to this now PLO and West Bank and Fatah are the major forces who Indian media will had supported. But now they had realized that the original people and the real fighters and who are fighting for the cause of Palestine is Hamas. These things were realized by Indian media also after this incidents.
Okay, we have more 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes more to conclude. So if anybody has a question, he might write it down in the comments and I'll read it and try to answer. Here, Brother Mohammad, it's written in English. Mutia. He said, I would like to ask Dr. Sami, to what extent could what's happening around the world with regard to demonstration, supporting can't read the whole message. Okay, Brother Muti, are you with us? Could you open the mic for Brother Muti?
Yes, hello there. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Alaikum salam. You may go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yes, thank you for organizing this webinar. Actually, my question to Dr. Sami is to what extent could the demonstrations supporting the Palestinian people around the world, and I mean the increasing awareness, could enforce the governments that support the Israeli occupation to change their attitudes and their policies with regard to stand in support with the Israeli occupation? I mean, could we politically benefit from these demonstrations and this change in the general awareness and popular awareness? Thank you.
Well,
do we have other questions? Okay, let it be the last question, and after that we'll be concluding with Dr. Basem Naim. Okay, go ahead, please, Dr. Sami.
I'm personally a big supporter of activism, demonstrations, and getting the public involved, but I wouldn't count on changing policies over a short term. These kind of things take time for them to precipitate or to make an impact on policymaking. You know, when we talk about, look at what happened during the Iraq war, there was a decision, a determination that they're going to go to war. There were demonstrations with the hundreds of thousands and sometimes even 500,000. I wasn't part of it in 2002, trying to prevent the invasion of Iraq. But of course, there was a decision already made. So I wouldn't, but at the same time, I wouldn't discount it. I mean, this is very important to change public opinion, to get people involved. Eventually, they will get through the political word. So the question is to what impact, to what effect these demonstrations will change policies. And my simple answer is that they don't in the short term, except in very few instances where the politicians themselves, they see that there is a danger for them to keep their seats. But when it comes to strategic decisions, and of course the protection of Israel is something that many people in the Western world, they see as a very strategic objective. It's going to take a long time to do that. You really have to change many attitudes, many institutions, as well as have a deep-rooted political movement that is going to gain political power, because this is at the end is about power. It's not about changing opinions. A lot of people know what's right and what's wrong. A lot of people know that Palestinians have rights, but what it is, it's the Palestinians are powerless. They don't have much power in this world, and therefore they cannot get through. Look at what happened in the siege of Gaza. The siege of Gaza is as much siege from the Egyptian side as it is from the Israeli side, and yet we cannot even change what's happening on one side, and that's why Gaza has been under siege now for almost 15 years. So to change that reality, you have to change the power structure that is preventing the Gazans from living a decent life. And that doesn't come just simply from demonstrations. Gazans have been going to the border in a very peaceful way. And how many people have changed policies with that? That's going to take a long time before it happens. So
Sami, we have two more questions.
Other means by which you can change policies. But certainly demonstrations are something that needs to be sustained, needs to go, because these are important tools.
Thank you very much. I'll take the next question to Dr. Anas. Here, Brother Mohammad Zahid asked, what are the causes 57 Muslim countries are not ready to help the Palestinians? They give only statement. This question for all speakers, anyone can answer. Dr. Anas, could you answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Just one very quick comment regarding the previous question, which I agree with Dr. Sami Al-Arian, but my very quick answer to Brother Mutiyar would be that protests on their own don't work. There needs to be a comprehensive approach towards lobbying governments and changing policy. Protest is a very important element, but on its own, it doesn't really work unless there's also sustained academic, intellectual, political, ideological approach with the efforts on the streets of various cities around the world. Then that would make a difference. Coming back to the question posed by Brother Mohammad Zahid, the problem of Palestine itself is actually a manifestation of a deep-rooted issue within the Muslim, Arab and Muslim worlds. And that is the absence of legitimacy. In the vast majority of countries in this scope, these 57 countries that you speak of, the vast majorities are run by either military dictatorships or by corrupt governments or by figures who arrived at power in an illegal, illegitimate way. And therefore, they themselves, their sole objective is to sustain their power, their grip on power. Palestine comes as a tool which they use, and they have used for decades, to sustain their grip on power, but not for the sake of Palestine itself. And once they find that Palestine poses an issue and a problem for them, they'll just get rid of it. They'll just be quiet about it. So when talking about Palestine, promoting Palestine, advocating Palestine, increase their popularity even by a portion of a degree, then they would use that. But now that the Palestinians are actually resisting in a way that they didn't in the past, now it's a problem. Palestine is a real problem. And therefore, you'll find that very few will actually come forward and say, yes, we support Palestine now. In fact, if anything, we are seeing more and more Arab and Muslim regimes. I'd like to emphasize this. We're talking about regimes. We're not talking about people. People, I think, unilaterally, without exclusion, they are with Palestine and with the Palestinians. But the regimes, we are seeing more and more now actually side with the Israelis. And this is in itself something which needs to be taken. So the problem, once again, the problem is that in our region, in the Arab and Muslim worlds, there is a crisis And that crisis is the crisis of political legitimacy, or the absence thereof. And as such, you will find virtually no state that will act in the way that the people wish for them to act, simply because they don't, they haven't been elected by those people in order to reflect their wishes.
Thank you, Dr. Anas. And the last question will be with Dr. Basem Naim, and with Dr. Basem Naim, inshallah, we will conclude this session. Hope that we will meet in near future, inshallah. Dr. Basem, like Aqil asked about the recent political shift in Israel and its impact on Israel's image and domestic and foreign policy. Would you be kind enough to comment on this?
Thank you very much. First, to comment shortly on the previous question, I think we Palestinians in particular here, we don't sell ourselves illusions that demonstrations alone have made the shift or this initial shift. But I have to emphasize that there is an initial political shift. It is not only a change in the public opinion. This is not caused because of the last escalation here in Gaza or because of the revolution in the social media. This is one factor, but I think other factors played a role in this. First of all, the shift in the Israeli society towards the right, extreme right. It is today nearly impossible to a lot of people around the world to defend this project anymore. The change in the United States and the win of some Democrats and progressive Democrats played a role. The social media and the participation of Palestinians on social media in different languages, the failure of the political project, what so-called two-state solution or peaceful negotiations, and the failure to kick out the resistance and its project from the political scene. I think a lot of factors have played a role to see this initial political change. I am sure we are going to witness a gradual, accumulative political change towards the Palestinian issue, and this the Zionist project is not anymore easy to defend or to keep it. And therefore, again, we are not selling ourselves illusions that only by demonstrations we will see the change. But this is a very important factor. It's a sign that at least these people have received the right message and are demonstrating for this right message. But I have raised my hand to put an open question maybe for the next meeting or for next webinar for the honored participant. We know, those who are working in the field of media, international media, that we are sending or conveying the message of the just cause of Palestine and Palestinians, in particular here in Gaza, or the resistance, that this message is conveyed to billions of people from China in the East up to the United States in the West, including Africa and Latin America, including Arabs and Muslims. The question is what kind of message? Today, you cannot talk with 2 or 3 tongues. If you write a tweet in Arabic or in English or in French, I can simply push on a translation button, then it's it. Therefore, if I write in Arabic or in English, but how can I balance my message? The message of rights, of humanitarian aspect, with the political rights, the message of heroism, with the message of being a victim. I send a message for Muslims and Arabs at the same time. Not all the people who are supporting me are one block. Some of them are supporting me simply because they are against Israel, or simply using the Palestinian cause as a tool in their internal struggle for political purposes. Some are supporting me because they are Muslims or Arabs, and others supporting me simply only for humanitarian or civil rights, not for political rights. It is a very complex mosaic. Therefore, how can our brothers in particular who are in the West, how can we develop a message that it is conveying the just cause of Palestine without being contradictory with the big, broad context of international law, of international politics? Because it is, again, the first question, are you ready to recognize Israel? This is not a question. This is a lesson of history. I cannot answer yes or no. But this is the first question. Why you are launching rockets, and are you ready to recognize Israel? And that's it. The question, how can we, again, this is not for this webinar, but maybe for a next one, or how can we develop a message or answer for a lot of questions which balance between our civil rights, our political rights, our audience, which some of them are Arabs and Muslims, and the others are who are in the West. This is one of the big challenges we are facing, how to develop our terminology without being contradictory with our own strategic goals. We have the right to resist, and we are really not intending to harm civilians, but we are at the same time victims, and we have no resources in this imbalanced battle. Lastly, when it comes to the Israeli government, I have to say in few lines, usually we are not commenting on the internal Israeli issues because we believe that all these discussions and disputes and changes in Israel are an internal Israeli matter. It has nothing to do, or it has nothing to do with our Palestinian faith or Palestinian question. If you talk about, for example, the strategic plans of the Israeli governments, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it is right or left, extreme right or extreme left. Settlements and settlement activities have gone all the time during all Israeli governments. When it comes to the Jerusalem and unified Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, there is no differences. When it comes to the vision of expelling as much as they can of Palestinian existence, as I mean people, inside Palestine, what they have tried to do in Sheikh Jarrah, it was only the tip of the iceberg. The main goal of this step was the plan in 2022 to eliminate any Palestinian existence or presence in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Hay al-Bustan, in Batn al-Hawa, in Silwan. Therefore, it is a continuous, steady plan of all political parties, from the extreme right to the extreme left. Therefore, we don't depend a lot on changes. But I am sorry to say that, unfortunately, we have wasted 7 decades, 70 years of waiting the American elections, and then the midterm elections, then the coming Israeli elections, and we have the Labours, and then the right, and the Likud. Again, what really helped us is only that they are leading an idiot policy by shifting more and more to the right, so that it makes it difficult for their friends to defend them or to advocate them. But we are not building our strategies or our politics, our vision based on this changes.
Thank you very much. I would like also to draw your attention to the second international conference on Palestine by CIGA, headed by Dr. Sami, Al-Arian, and most probably the Palestinian Narrative is one important issue that will be tackled in that conference. Most probably participants will indulge in deep discussions on Palestinian narrative and how to present it and develop it, because I'm also convinced that whatever Dr. Sami said about the Zionist narrative applies very much, but in the case of the Palestinian narrative is something that needs to be developed and needs to be enhanced. We have a lot of challenges, and certainly there isn't something unified. And as Dr. Basem said earlier, that we have sometimes two kinds of narratives, one coming from Gaza and another one coming from Ramallah, and not necessarily matching with each other. Anyhow, I think we, at least in this webinar, succeeding in maybe starting a discussion. Hopefully we'll be seeing further sessions, if not by Asia Middle East Forum, maybe by CIGA and other partners in this discussion. Thank you very much, and hope to see you soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
And
salam
to every one of you, especially for our brothers and sisters from India. Assalamu alaikum wa
Alaikum
rahmatullahi.
assalam. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا.